So this is technically week 5 of MGT 6152 Project Performance Management. And I'm getting all kinds of offers and stuff. Let me close this down. And so today is the topics, the performance domain activities. So we're in the performance domain and we're talking about project procurement and project cost. The one big kind of change, and I'll talk about it some in the presentation, is that PMI with PMBOK 8 has changed their approach or their view of what procurement for years. Ever since I've been involved with PMI, they've always treated procurement as a project's responsibility. And now they moved it out of that as a sole responsibility of the project. And it's better reflects reality in that it's part of the corporate structure. It's a corporate function. Basically, a big chunk of the execution of the procurement belongs with that group. But at the same time, as a project manager, so we still need to know what they're doing because we have to interface with them. And we'll talk about that. What PMI did is they changed the term procurement management to project sourcing. It's sourcing of resources. And then there's something called a sourcing strategy, which would have been our make or buy analysis that we have in the procurement as this today. So since the course is kind of designed on PMBOK 7, we're going to follow that, but then also have a separate treatment of PMBOK 8 so that we can make that transition and we can position that the right way. And so we'll do that as we get going. The readings are pretty straightforward. I've got 2 notes here that I'll refer to in the lecture, the managing project procurement and cost notes, and then the earned value management notes. Those of you that were in the 6151 class, we did a pretty deep dive in how to plan for earned value. And this time we'll probably not overlap too much, but it should be familiar with you. And mostly going to focus on the measurement part of it now in this lecture. So let me see if I can get set up here. My audience here has tripled in size now. It grew by 33%. We got one other person. All right, you guys see that okay? See those people standing there talking in front of that? Thanks. So this is MGT 6152, week 5, and we're going to talk about project procurement, project costs, and earned value. And again, the fact you guys are here, especially today, I mean, I wanted to stay home today. So, it's a nice day to sleep in, and it says something about your commitment to what's going on. So this session, we're going to talk about procurement, execution, and cost control, and earned value, and how they support stronger performance. We'll begin by looking at procurement as part of the project work performance, including supplier selection, contract structure, contract administration, all that exciting stuff, and supplier engagement during execution. And then we'll transition into cost management, and then we'll shift into monitoring control cost. And then from there, we move to earned value as an integrated performance management tool. And we'll see how things like plan value, earned value, and actual costs work together to support variance analysis and project performance indication and forecasting. And we'll close by looking at these things together, and I'll have some examples at the end. Project work performance connects external sourcing and cost control to project outcomes. And so the project work performance depends on how well the team coordinates external sourcing, manages spending, and converts plans to controlled execution. And we're going to move deeper this week into the project performance domain by looking at those 2 areas and how they influence execution, and how we keep execution under control. We'll look at external procurement, or what we call sourcing now, cost performance. And the reason these belong together is that they both directly shape our ability to deliver outcome, right? So we're having to buy materials, buy resources, and produce outcome. Recall that project work is the point where plans are translated into real activity. And at that stage, the project team what we're doing is we're coordinating resources, managing constraints, and responding to issues, and managing progress towards our intended outcome. PMBOK 7 presents project work as one of the core performance domains, and specifically includes working with procurements as part of effective project management execution. But at the same time, PMBOK 8 updates this overall framework, and they no longer treat procurement as a separate standalone performance domain. Instead, procurement is addressed in Appendix X4, and it's framed as something that extends from the organization's larger procurement function. And even with that shift, PMI still emphasizes that procurement practices influence cost, efficiency, quality, and timely delivery, which means they remain highly relevant to project managers. The same logic applies to cost management. Managing project costs is not just an accounting exercise. It involves estimating, budgeting, monitor, controlling, and forecasting so that the team can recognize variances early and respond to performance declines or issues earlier. The idea is we want to understand what's going on early in the project as we can so that we can take action if we need to. And I have some class notes in here on procurement and cost that makes this connection. So read those class notes. And in this slide, we established the central idea that for the rest of the presentation, that project performance is shaped not only by what the team does internally, but also by how well it coordinates external sourcing and interprets cost performance as the work unfolds. We'll focus on PMBOK 7 here, how it treats procurement as a recognizable project activity within the project planning and project work. In PMBOK 7, the process-based PMI view, well, it put this way, in PMBOK 7 and other process-based views, procurement remains a practical project activity that affects delivery performance. So before we look at PMBOK 8, it's useful to look at what's going on with the traditional project framing from PMBOK 7. Then this is all defined in the PMBOK, in the process groups of practice guide. Procurement's not treated as a separate standalone performance domain, but it's embedded within the project management system. The planning performance domain explicitly includes procurement as one of the variables that must be planned and aligned with the project work performance domain. And that includes working with procurements as part of effective project execution. So this means that procurement is still part of the project manager's practical field of concern. It's not something completely outside the project. During planning, the team considers what must be obtained externally and how those external needs fit the scope, schedule, resources, and communication and metrics needs of the project. During project work, the team needs to coordinate procurements as the execution unfolds, and that includes ensuring externally sourced goods and services support the intended outcome of the project rather than disrupt them. The prior view or the process view-based view in the process groups practice guide makes this explicit connection. It preserves the familiar process flow of plan procurement management, conduct procurements in executing, and control procurements as part of monitoring controlling. And the older process structure is still useful because it gives us a concrete way to understand how procurement activities unfold across the project lifecycle. So the key idea is that the traditional view, PMBOK 7 view, is still a recognizable project activity with practical planning and execution and control implications. It's the baseline understanding that we need before we can kind of understand how PMBOK 8 reframes procurement explicitly as a sourcing within the organizational context. So the old way of looking at it is the project was concerned with all of the procurement process, and they've kind of split that up, and they said, okay, the project has to figure out what it needs to procure, and we have this legal or procurement department over here that's going to manage all the relationship with the supplier and the vendor. So we have to, but as a project manager, you still have to know what all is going on. And I think I've mentioned this a couple of times. It's hard to classes run together, but I think it's probably been about 20 years since I worked on a project where I, as the project manager, had to worry about vendor selections, sending out, RFPs and soliciting bids, all that, awarding contracts, all that stuff. And it was for a small company. Any company of any size that I've worked for had their own legal department, mainly because of the consequences of not applying a standard sort of approach to how their organization handles contracts, right? You don't want one project doing it one way, and it opens you up to risk if you're not consistent. to legal risk. So the idea is on a small project, you may have a point of contact in that department that you deal with, and you interface with them and you say, well, we've decided that we need to buy this widget, or we need this many people and these skills. And they would, through that point of contact, they would coordinate that with maybe an approved vendors list or something like that. And we've worked like that in reality for a long time. It's just taken PMI a little while to get there. And procurement's also one of these weird areas in project management where you're kind of planning and executing at the same time. It's a little more agile than the overall project management framework that it might be in that you have to do make or buy analysis. You have to figure out what you need. So you've got to do a lot of that kind of executing work, building things or analyzing things and determining things in order to communicate to suppliers or to the legal department or to procurement department what you need. When it comes to trying to explain it to people how it fits in a project, it's always kind of saddled both areas at the same time. So it's like you need to understand what you're going to need to buy before you can complete your plan, which means you got to do some work before you can complete your plan, which goes against sort of the traditional planning view and more into the adaptive planning view. It's kind of how that works. So in PMBOK 8, it reframes sourcing within the broader organizational context. So PMBOK 8 shifts the procurement towards organizational sourcing while preserving its delivery importance. And it's an important transition. This is an important transition for the presentation because PMBOK 8 changes how procurement is positioned in the framework, as I've been talking about. Rather than treating procurement as a distinct knowledge area, legacy topic, or presenting it as a highly visible project-centered process stream, PMBOK 8 moves the detailed procurement decision into Appendix 4, which is called Procurement. And the appendix includes topics such as the procurement overview, the make or buy analysis, procurement strategy, bid processes, documents, source selection analysis, source selection criteria, contract type, and claims administration. And this shift's important because it signals a broader perspective that PMBOK 8 places greater emphasis on the project management part of the larger organizational value delivery system. And procurement is increasingly understood as something that may originate through enterprise sourcing or purchasing function rather than entirely within the project manager's direct control, as I was talking about. The 8th edition also emphasizes updated key concepts, refined principles. They reintroduce focus areas and updated performance domains rather than preserving the older structures. So the message here is that it's not that procurement is disappeared from project responsibility. The better interpretation is that it's been reframed. It's now presented less as a narrowly isolated project mechanics topic and more as a sourcing-related capability that interacts with project governance, finance, contracts, suppliers, organizational systems, the entire project environment. That makes the project manager's role in procurement more collaborative. In other words, you have to collaborate with this corporate function. And even with that change, procurement or sourcing matters directly to project performance because external suppliers still affect cost, timing, quality, risk, and stakeholder satisfaction. That's why in this presentation, we'll continue to cover procurement as an execution function, and we'll need to understand how sourcing decisions and supplier performance influence the real work of project delivery. And even if PMBOK 8 now locates much of that detail in the appendix, it frames it more organizationally than before. In my view, they've kind of gone a little bit too far by just moving it out completely. I suspect that in PMBOK 9, it'll come back to some middle ground because it's not going to go away. Matter of fact, more projects than ever rely on sourcing. I mean, a lot of organizations, it's kind of like you source everything and just assemble it or customize it to what you're doing. Project managers still need practical sourcing or procurement knowledge during execution. So after, we've talked about PMBOK 8, how it reframes procurement, more sourcing within a broader organizational context. The next point is that project managers still need working knowledge of how procurement operates during execution. And the shift in framing doesn't remove your responsibility as a project manager to coordinate external work. It changes the context a little bit and not the need for competency in that domain. In practice, project managers don't fully own the organization's sourcing or purchasing processes, like I've been talking about. The work may sit with the procurement office or supply chain function or a contract manager or another enterprise group. Even with that, the project manager still has to help define what's needed, when it's needed, how supplier performance connects to your project milestones, what happens if external dependency slips. PMBOK 8 reinforces this broader concept-oriented view through topics such as procurement strategy, source selection, contract models, and claims administration. This is why procurement or sourcing literacy still matters in project execution. If a vendor misses a delivery date, quality standards are not met, a pricing issue arises, or a contract dispute slows work, the impact shows up in the project performance pretty quickly. Schedules can slip, costs can rise, risk can increase, and stakeholder confidence can erode. That means the project manager needs enough understanding of the sourcing and procurement execution to coordinate effectively, escalate issues appropriately, and make informed decisions. The class notes support this by emphasizing that supplier selection, contracts, procurement monitoring, and supplier relationship management and closeout as execution relevant activities. So the core message here is pretty straightforward, that organizational outsourcing may own the formal procurement function, but the project manager still needs practical sourcing knowledge to protect delivery performance. So it's really it's sort of always been this way in practice, where we had to depend on this sourcing group, whether it's whatever they call it, the contract administration folks. And you're always kind of relying on them, but the accountability always fell on the project manager. So now they're kind of splitting that up, and your responsibility is to coordinate, but they're going to be accountable for making sure the contracts are executed. So it's helped kind of position that accountability, but it's still a shared idea. Procurement execution still follows a practical flow from needs definition to closeout. Even if we've reframed procurement more broadly within organizational sourcing, the actual execution work still follows a recognizable flow. Projects still need to identify what needs to be obtained externally, decide how it's going to be sourced. We're going to need to engage sellers, manage performance, and close out our obligations properly. The procurement appendix in PMBOK 8 reflects this sequence through project procurement strategy, bid process and documents, source selection, contract models, and claims administration. The class notes also describe this. They begin by defining the procurement requirements, then developing a procurement strategy, creating procurement documents, evaluating, selecting suppliers, negotiating finalized contracts, managing supplier relationships, monitoring procurement activities, and then closing out the procurements. This sequence, it's helpful to know because it shows that procurement execution is not it's not a one and done isolated task. It's a chain of interrelated activities that we need to be able to carry out. The flow also reinforces why procurement matters to project performance. Weak procurement definition can lead to supplier mismatch. Poor sourcing strategy can create cost or timing problems. Weak contract arrangements can make disputes more likely. Inadequate supplier monitoring can create downstream schedule delays, quality issues, or unexpected cost growth. While the language may shift from procurement towards sourcing, the project manager still needs to understand the practical life cycle. The main message here is that procurement execution is still a structured project management process, whether it's led primarily by the project manager or supported by an enterprise sourcing function. We need to move from a clear need definition to a disciplined closeout if we're going to protect our cost, schedule, quality, and maintain stakeholder confidence. So again, we're kind of circling here around this same idea that it's an important thing. I think it's one of the problems with moving it out of the sort of the main project execution performance domain and into an appendix in the PMBOK guide is it tends to say, well, that's not important. It still is important. And if you're going to sit for the PMP, sometime there'll still be procurement questions on the exam. Anything that's in the book is, even if it's in an appendix, is fair game. Sourcing suppliers turns procurement planning into market engagement. Soliciting suppliers translate procurements into strategy and into formal market engagement. Once procurement requirements and sourcing strategy have been defined, the next practical step is solicitation. So in planning is where we would define our procurement requirements and sourcing strategy. And that's why we're not going to cover it in detail here. We covered it in the other class. But the idea is you have to decide as a project team what you need, what resources you need in terms of labor resources, mechanical resources, technology resources, all of that stuff. And then you have to decide whether or not is it better for the project for us to build it ourselves, or do we have internal organizational capability that we can need from, or do we need to go out on the marketplace and purchase it? And the way I like to look at this is that the project is always, you're the buyer, right? You're buying scope from somebody. So you have some work you need to do that's part of your scope. Say it's a work package in the work breakdown structure. You need to procure that work package. So you're going to go out on the marketplace and buy that scope from somebody on the marketplace. You have to determine what scope that you need to purchase is kind of what's saying. What are the project scope you need to acquire on the market? And so this is where the planning is translated into external market engagement. And from the perspective of the project, if you're outsourcing, you're always the buyer. Okay. Now you may be doing your project for someone else who's buying scope from you, for them. But in that case, you would be the seller. But when you're going out and buying things for the project, or acquiring things for the project, you're the buyer. So in all this conversation, we're looking at this from the perspective of the buyer. The project sourcing team prepares the procurement documents, communicates what's needed, and invites qualified sellers to respond. And so in this view, what they're talking about here or what I'm talking about here, is that you would prepare all this information and you would get with your procurement people. And they would have a sourcing team, someone who goes out and deals with contracts and vendors and things like that. You'd need to coordinate with them what your need is. So this view that PMI is taking here is they've really kind of added a little extra layer of collaboration that we need to worry about, especially when it comes to project communications, and they've added more stakeholders. In reality, we've had those for a number of years, but in true, strict kind of looking at things black and white, they've added that extra layer in here by moving it to a corporate function. In the class notes, I talk about this stage of this through the creation of project documents, such as requests for proposals, requests for quotations, invitations for bid. And each of these is structured to communicate our project needs, scope, pricing expectations, evaluation criteria, and things like that. This step matters because weak solicitation creates downstream problems. If requirements are unclear, if evaluation criteria are vague or teams are incomplete, suppliers may respond inconsistently, and important assumptions may remain hidden, and later disputes can become more likely. A well-structured solicitation process improves transparency, supports fair comparison, and increases the chances of selecting a seller that can actually meet our project needs. It's also important for project managers, even when the procurement office leads this formal process. The project manager often helps define the technical requirements, milestones, delivery expectation, constraints, and acceptance conditions. In that sense, solicitation is not just a purchasing event, it's a performance activity, project performance activity, because it shapes the quality of the supplier responses and the realism of future execution. Soliciting suppliers is why procurement planning becomes market engagement. And the quality of that step directly affects what happens next in the sourcing, selection, and contract performance. Bidders conferences reduce ambiguity before formal supplier selection. So bidders conference is a special type of vendor solicitation. It's sometimes it's called a pre-bid or pre-proposal conference. And they're structured meetings that are held after the solicitation documents are issued and before proposals are submitted. And the purpose is to clarify requirements, timing, constraints, and contract expectations so that all prospective sellers are working from the same understanding. This supports fairness and improves proposal quality because questions are addressed and controlled in a transparent setting. I've been through these a few times where what you do is, like I mentioned here, you send out all of your requests for bid, requests for proposal, whatever mechanism you're using to get the information back from all of the people that supplied you, put together it's essentially, this is any clarifications that we have come out of that. And then you send out an invitation to say, we're going to bring all the vendors together who want to come, and we're going to have a pre-bid conference. We'll go over the bid proposal again, and then we'll give everybody a chance to ask questions, any kind of final stuff you need, and then you submit your proposal after that. One of the interesting one I was on was with the city of Dallas. It was a while back, and they were looking at changing out their telephone vendor. And you could kind of tell from the mood in the room who they were leaning to, And so you can pick up on things like that too. You can kind of judge whether or not it's really worth pursuing the bid, right? So in our case, it was AT&T. They were the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They were the incumbent company. We were a smaller telecommunications provider. And so based on what we came away from the bidders conference with, we decided not to bid. Okay. Now, I've been in another one where with the Texas, what used to be TXU, I think they're Encore now, the electric company, they wanted to put a bunch of telemetry circuits so they could tell what the currents are. They could put it all in a big room. It was just a big giant internet for them. And what they did is we had the bidders conference, and they wound up selecting 3 vendors to fund what we called a bake-off. It was basically, you go and start the project, and after 6 months, we'll see where each one of you is at, and we'll decide which one we want to go with at that time. And we didn't win the bid. Again, the incumbent, it wasn't AT&T, it was some other company, but the incumbent always has an advantage over competitive bidders out there. But that is just different ways that companies are trying to make sure that, one, the vendors know there's no misunderstandings, that the one thing that's nice about the bidders conference is that it makes kind of levels the playing field for everybody, and it makes it clear who your competitors are, that kind of thing. The bake-off thing was nice is that they actually got working product. We each had a little different piece of the scope. So the electric company still got some working results after the end of 6 months, but then they selected the vendor that would carry them through. It was like a 5-year project, but it gave them the information on which company they thought best increased their likelihood of success. So this is a kind of thing that we don't really talk about it much in a lot of the project management areas, but it's an important part of this. In the new view, how I see this working, I got involved with this a little bit at Texas Instruments, where we had sourcing. We had all these international contracts. So we had contracts with Chinese companies and Japanese companies, Indian, all over the world. France, they had their own vendor department. And what we would do is they would have these bidders conferences, but they would have the project manager and the key team members all come and participate in these bidders conferences. So, you had to know how they're going to work, and you need to know what's going on. So it's important. You may never encounter one if you work for the same company for a long time, they don't do them. Then again, if you get out and start doing consulting work, you're probably going to get into something like this. But from a project perspective, they help reduce uncertainty and ambiguity before we award the contract. If you don't have those issues resolved before you award the contract, then you're probably going to wind up with claims or even wind up in court. They often reveal unclear specifications, unrealistic assumptions, missing details, or conflicting expectations early enough to correct them. So when questions and answers are documented and shared with all bidders, the process becomes more consistent and defensible. And that improves the quality of the responses, and that helps the team move into the evaluation and selection with fewer surprises. So what we did with what City of Dallas did when we were there, they took all of the information at the bidders conference and created a big sort of minutes of the meeting and sent in attachments and all that, and sent all of that information out to everybody. And then they gave us one more round of submit a written question. And then if you submit a written question, it was distributed to everybody. and the answer was distributed to everybody. So the idea is there's no favoritism in here, even though the incumbents have the thing with the incumbents is they're already there. They know the culture, and they can generally leverage that from a cost perspective to be much lower price than people who are having to go in and compete with them. A proposal evaluation. So we submitted our bids, we've gotten everything back. Now we're into proposal evaluation. And so proposal evaluation and source selection convert supplier responses into a defensible award decision. Source selection should align supplier capability, cost, schedule, fit, and risk with the project needs. So after solicitation and bidders conferences, the procurement process moves into proposal evaluation and source selection. And this is the point where the supplier responses are reviewed in a more structured way so the team can determine which seller is best positioned to support the project. And the key idea is that the source selection is not just about choosing the lowest price, it's about making a dispensable decision based on the project's actual needs and constraints. It's not unusual. Many of the projects that we're on, we would have a scorecard of all these things that we thought were important to the project and to the company. And we would all rate those individually. And then they would take those and compile them and come up with a list of how well each one of these vendors did. And typically we would go with maybe not always the top person, the top one on the scorecard, because they may be the least expensive, but someone else might be a little better quality. So we had to balance that. But that's typically how we would take all these proposals and then evaluate them. And we have in the class notes, I describe this step as evaluating supplier bids or proposals using predefined criteria such as cost, quality, delivery schedule, and performance, and other things like financial. If you're going to be entering a contractual relationship with somebody for a long period of time, it's almost like getting married. You want to make sure that you want to know about that person's background. You want to know about that vendor's background. You want to know about their financial history, things like that. All that criteria gets involved in there. And it's important because it shows it's important because source selection should be systematic and evidence-based rather than informal or purely price-driven. Now, PMBOK 8 also includes source selection analysis, source selection criteria, contract type, and claims administration. And so their framing there also supports that supplier selection is meaningful performance decision, not just an administration function. So what they're telling you here is you just can't punt this responsibility to the procurement department. It's still the project's responsibility. Ultimately, the project manager is accountable for the success of the project. The seller chosen at this stage will influence our execution readiness, our coordination needs, risk exposure, and downstream project performance. From our project manager's perspective, this is where procurement and project performance clearly intersect. The project manager may not own the full sourcing function, but still needs to help assess whether proposals fit the technical requirements, whether proposal delivery supports the schedule, whether quality expectations are realistic, and whether the supplier creates a manageable or excessive risk. And weak source selection decision often creates problems later in cost, schedule, quality, and stakeholder confidence. The central message here is that proposal evaluation and source selection turn supplier responses into a defensible. Now, use that term defensible, meaning that if you were questioned about your decision, you would be able to defend that this is my rationale, these are the things I've done in a ethical, honest, transparent, all that sort of way. And so you're into a defensible award decision that supports execution and avoids creating downstream problems. The contract type allocates costs, incentives, and control between the buyer and seller. So the contract type shapes how the project costs, performance, incentive, and change exposure are shared between the buyer and the seller. Well, the project is between the project and the vendor. You want to use that language. After source selection, the next important question is how the work will be contractually structured. This is where the contract type becomes relevant to project performance. The contract is not just a legal formality. It defines how cost, risk, uncertainty, incentives, and change exposure are distributed between the buyer and the seller. So it defines our working agreement. This matters because different projects need different contractual arrangements. In some situations, the buyer, the project, wants stronger price predictability and tighter definition of deliverables. In other situations, the work is more uncertain, the scope may evolve, or the buyer needs greater flexibility, and the contract type should fit those conditions rather than simply follow habit or preference. So this need from certainty to uncertainty is the scope. If you've got a pretty nailed down scope, there's not a lot of ambiguous situations or uncertainty in it, then you're probably going to want to go to fixed price contracts with your vendors. But if you've got something that's not really well defined, and this is where in the adaptive world, we run into issues because by definition in the adaptive world, the scope is really undefined until it's accepted by the product manager or the customer. How do you write contracts for something like that? Well, we have cost plus contracts for that. And that's where you see cost plus contracts a lot. You'll hear about them in the government a lot because maybe they don't know, they're going to have to replace, some infrastructure someplace where they don't know what it's going to cost to take it down and put it back up. They got an idea, but they're not close. So they'll award a cost plus. And then what happens is there's no incentive on that end for the project team or the vendor to perform efficiently because they're getting paid for whatever it costs them, right? So they can run the cost up and still get paid. So they get cost plus a percentage of cost. So those contracts require a lot more administration, a lot more governance than a fixed price does. Again, the procurement in the appendix there, they talk about contract there as in terms of pricing, delivery, schedules, performance, and expectations, and supplier obligations. All that must be negotiated and finalized carefully. So the typical flow, we haven't talked about that in here yet, but the typical flow is that we go through and we solicit the bids, we evaluate the proposals, then we award the contract. And it doesn't mean we execute the contract. Usually there's a negotiation period between the award and the actual execution of the contract, signing of the contract to finalize details. So from a project management perspective, contract types affects much more than the procurement paperwork. It influences how much monitoring needs to be done, the likelihood of disputes, how we handle changes, the level of cost control pressure during execution, and other things like payments, how we accept results, all of those kind of contract administration issues. A poor contract fit can create avoidable issues in schedule, quality claims, and financial governance. When I wrote that, it looked a lot better than it sounds coming out. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is that if we don't do a good job of finding the right contract for the work that needs to be done, we're creating problems for ourselves that we could have avoided by negotiating correctly in the first place. So a well-chosen contract type, by contrast, supports clearer expectations and better alignment between project needs and behavior. Fixed price contracts work best when scope and delivery are well defined, as I mentioned. A fixed price contract provides stronger cost certainty when scope, requirements, and deliverables can be defined clearly in advance. Fixed price contracts are usually most effective when the work can be defined before execution begins. And in that setting, the buyer, the project, and the vendor, the seller, can agree on the scope, they can agree on the deliverables, performance expectations, and a price with a reasonable level of confidence. That makes the contract attractive when cost predictability is important and the project team wants a stronger baseline for managing external work. Usually in fixed contracts, you have milestones where you make payments to people, and so there's a lot. You can just kind of say, this is what we're expecting on a certain date, and you don't have to do a lot of monitoring other than just making sure they're on track, because all of the financial risk is on the vendor because it's a fixed price. They get paid the same money no matter how much it costs them to do it. Now, I have seen fixed price contracts where you build in exceptions, but still at the basic, it's a fixed price. The main advantage of a fixed price arrangement or contract is price certainty for the buyer, for the project. If the requirements are stable and the seller understands the work well, the contract can create a clear framework for execution and make financial planning easier. At the same time, that price certainty usually means more cost risk is carried by the seller or the vendor. If the seller underestimates the effort encounters inefficiencies or experiences cost growth, that risk does not automatically move back to the project or to the buyer unless the contract terms allow it. And that's where I say I've seen exceptions. That's also why fixed price contracts become problematic when scope is unclear or evolving. If important requirements are vague at the time of award, the project may quickly encounter disagreements over what was included and whether something is a change or who should absorb the additional cost over time. In practice, weak upfront definition often turns a fixed price contract into a source of claims and execution friction rather than cost stability. And I've seen this where you get into disputes, well, whether that was defined, interpreted, have these discussions over the language of this statement of work in a fixed price contract. And, if it's a change, well, then usually the buyer has to pay for the change. If it's not a change, if it's like, well, it's what we contracted for, then it's onto the seller. And if you don't do a good job of defining expectations up front, then you're going to wind up with all these problems later. Now, you should put in your contract, and it should be in here. In most contracts, they are, is how do you handle disputes and claims? And there should be a process for that. So the key lesson here is that fixed price contracts are not automatically the safest choice in every situation. They work best when work is sufficiently stable and well-defined to support realistic pricing and clear mutual expectations. When that condition exists, fixed price contracts can support predictability and control. When it doesn't, it can create downstream performance problems. The next type of contract, cost reimbursable contracts, fit work with greater uncertainty and evolving scope. Cost reimbursable contracts provide more flexibility when scope is uncertain, but they require stronger buyer oversight and cost control. These contracts are often more appropriate when the work can't be defined with well enough precision to support a realistic fixed price agreement. From a project perspective, you generally want to lean towards the fixed price because the risk of that, most of the risk, the financial risk and performance risk is on the vendor. But if you can't, you can move into a cost plus. And in those situations, the project may still need to move forward, but the uncertainty has to be managed in a different way. And so instead of locking into one firm total price, the buyer agrees to reimburse allowable costs, usually with some fee structure or contractual terms that define how the seller will be compensated. So cost plus 10%. And you can put performance incentives on there. You can say, if it's on time, then we're going to pay you an additional 5%. You can put incentives, cost plus incentives is what it's called. You can put incentives in there to kind of manage that tendency to, since it's cost plus, to not pay attention to the cost, right? If you put an incentive to finish early or to finish under budget, then that builds that kind of budget idea into the cost plus. In other words, we want to finish before a certain date under a certain ceiling number. You don't know what the ceiling is, but maybe you set a high number. And if they deliver, we'll pay you an additional 10% over our other incentive. Build things like that. So there's a spectrum of these things. And usually the more uncertainty there is in the scope, the more incentives are built into it because it's more uncertainty in there. This makes contracts price useful when the scope evolves and technical complexity is higher, or the work contains like research and discovery work or development elements that are hard to estimate up front. And in this sense, cost reimbursable contracts trade some price certainty for flexibility, and the project gains room to adapt, and the buyer takes on more cost exposure and therefore must pay for closer attention to monitoring and control. And this is why cost plus or cost reimbursable contracts are kind of good, or sort of good for the adaptive model. Probably more of a preference over there because it gives you that room to manage, have the scope be flexible. However, most of the adaptive projects that I've worked on, they will fund a team at a fixed price. They'll say, well, we're going to fund this team like on a time and materials, which we'll talk about next. But they'll fund the team for, say, a year. And we're going to trust the team to work with the product owners to deliver the most valuable results. And so they've kind of taken the resources, the team is a fixed cost, and they don't attach it to the scope of the work. The scope can remain fluid. So from a project performance perspective, a cost reimbursable contract doesn't reduce the need for discipline. It increases the need for discipline on the buyer side. So it's much more monitoring, making sure that the vendor's paying attention to the cost. The project team needs good cost tracking, strong visibility into what the supplier's effort is and what they're spending. So it requires more transparency on the vendor side. The project team needs to make sure there's clear oversight and progress towards deliverables. So there needs to be transparency on the vendor side. Without all that, flexibility can turn into uncontrolled cost growth and weak accountability and downstream concerns. So the central message here is that cost reimbursable contracts can be a strong fit for certain work, but they succeed only if the buyer or the project is prepared to manage oversight, documentation, and cost control actively. So in other words, a lot of effort. It's one of the things you want to do too, back to planning and the budgeting. If you're going to go with a contract like this, then you need to build in that extra effort into your project plan. And I've been on projects where they didn't do that, and they wound up going over budget and behind schedule because they didn't have the human resources to deal with all this change and things that are going on. Time and materials contracts support flexible work but require active oversight. So time and materials contracts provide adaptable execution support, but hours, rates, and scope drift needs to be monitored closely. Time and materials contracts are often used when the buyer needs flexibility, but the work is not certain enough to require a fully cost reimbursable structure. So in this case, it's clearly kind of undefined. They're common when specialized labor, short cycle support, staff augmentation, maintenance work, or incremental technical effort is needed. But the total amount of effort cannot be estimated precisely at the start. So as I was talking about earlier with the adaptive projects, they'll cost reimbursable. They'll say, our time and materials. We've got 10 people on the team. We're going to pay them 40 hours a week for a year. That's our time. And any, materials they need, we'll provide them with computers, whatever it is. We'll pay their, lodging and expense if they have to travel, stuff like that. That's the kind of contracts that, as a consultant, I usually worked on as a time and materials contract, especially if I was going into like a project rescue situation where I didn't really have any idea what was going on and the organization didn't really know. And they were basically hiring me to come in there and do some forensic project work and try to turn the project around. And so a lot of these staff augmentation contracts, and some of you may work that way. I worked probably 20 something years just from one staff augmentation contract. I used to have my own, well, I still do have my own LLC and work strictly on 1099 basis or contract basis. But then around the early 2000s, Microsoft got into some trouble for having people under quote contract exclusive for like years. And basically they were pseudo employees. And so they have a big class action lawsuit, and the employees or these contractors won that class action lawsuit. So they had to get paid back for like vacation time and benefits and all that kind of stuff. And so all these companies kind of got, well, we're not going to hire anybody unless they're through a third party. And then you go through the third party and they want to hire you as an employee because technically you are. And so we go to these time and materials contracts, and that's the high use of those is kind of where that came from. In this type of arrangement, the buyer generally pays for the labor time used and the materials consumed based on agreed rates and returns. So that we go in and we're going to hire this software developer for, say the software developer makes $100 an hour, which is probably low by today's standards. Typically what they'll do is they'll multiply that by some factor of 3.5 or something like that. So the cost to the project is probably going to be $400 or $500 per hour for a highly skilled person. So you have to factor that in. And one of the things you think of is, well, can we hire these people directly? So that's some of the decision you have to make here. But it makes the contract more adaptable than fixed price because the work can continue even when the total effort is not fully known in advance. At the same time, It means that as the project, you need to actively watch how time and effort and costs are accumulating. So as a project manager, and you've got a bunch of staff augmentation going on for your human resources, you got to make sure that people have work to do and that their timesheets are accurate and all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of that kind of management work that needs to be done. This is a key management issue with time and materials contracts. So the contract can be practical and efficient, but only when we have disciplined oversight. The project team needs visibility into the hours worked, the rates applied, work completed, and whether the effort is still aligned with the project priorities. Otherwise, the project can experience slow cost growth and weak accountability and gradual scope expansion or scope creep without clear control point. And so from a project performance standpoint, time and materials contracts are not inherently weak or risky. They're simply less self-constraining than fixed price agreements. Their success depends on strong monitoring, clear communication, and disciplined control over what work is being authorized and performed. Time and materials contracts can be useful, flexible option, but they only perform well when the project manager applies active oversight and effort and over cost and scope and schedule, those things. So choosing the right contract. Choosing the right contract depends on scope clarity, risk allocation, and control needs. Contract choice should match the nature of the work, the level of uncertainty, and the amount of oversight the buyer can provide. So after looking at all these three main contract families, the reason we call them families is because underneath each one of those, there's various forms of it. The next step is to bring them together into one practical selection idea. Contract type should fit the work. The goal is not to memorize the one best contract type, but to understand that different contract structure performs better under different project conditions. Fixed price contracts are usually the strongest when the scope is stable, deliverables are clearly defined, and the seller can price the work with reasonable confidence. Cost reimbursable contracts are more appropriate when uncertainty is higher, and the work may evolve as execution progresses. Time and materials contracts are often useful when the buyer needs adaptable support or variable effort, but still wants a simpler structure than a full cost reimbursable contract. One of the things about time and materials contract, usually the terms of those contracts are pretty simple. We want someone or this resource for this time period at this rate. They show up, we approve their work, they get paid. Pretty, and you don't have to do a bunch of scope definition, a bunch of, dispute language, all that stuff. But the common issue across all of these three different types of contracts is risk allocation and control. As uncertainty rises, price certainly tends to fall. The buyer usually needs more active oversight. That means the contract choice is not just a procurement matter, but it's a performance decision because it influences how the team will manage cost, exposure, and scope changes. We should connect the contract structure back to the broader project system. A poor contract fit can create avoidable problems later in execution, including weak cost control, change disputes, unclear accountability, supplier tension. A good fit, on contrast, supports more realistic expectations, smoother coordination between the buyer and seller. And so the main takeaway is simple. The right contract type depends on the work, the uncertainty surrounding it, and the level of oversight the project can realistically sustain. So even if you have, say, a cost reimbursable contract, if you don't have the expertise or the bandwidth to monitor it and work with the vendor, now we can offload some of that to the procurement department. But the idea still is that the project responsible for making sure that the scope is done. You need to factor that in because then that can cause you, that may negate your decision to outsource. You may have to insource it if you can't manage the contract. You got to take all that stuff into consideration. So it speaks to contract administration. Contract administration keeps the agreement aligned with the project execution. So contract administration assures that obligations, changes, and communications stay aligned with the execution needs. A contract, once it's awarded and executed, the project doesn't simply move on and hope the agreement manages itself. contract administration is the ongoing work of making sure that the agreement remains active, understood, and aligned with actual project execution. It connects the formal contract to the day-to-day reality of deliverables, performance, and expectations. So there's a whole administrating the contract, accepting results, signing for work, approving payment, all of the things that go on with the contract. And all this matters because even if we have a really well-written contract, it can cause problems if it's not administered carefully. Dates may be missed, obligations may be interpreted differently, the acceptance conditions may be unclear, and dates and changes may begin informally without proper documentation. And when that happens, misunderstandings can grow into claims, disputes, schedule delays, and cost increases. From the perspective of the project, contract administration includes monitoring contractual obligations, verifying that agreed deliverables are being provided, documenting key communication decisions, and managing contract-related issues before they escalate. And the PMBOK 8 claims administration is part of the discussion and reinforces the contract administration remains a meaningful part of execution. And I also have this documented in the notes, in the class notes, that support contract administration through activities such as monitoring procurement, performance, managing supplier relationships, and taking corrective action when obligations aren't being met. So contract administration is not just legal housekeeping. It's a practical execution discipline that helps supplier work, communications, and changes aligned with the agreement and with the project needs. One thing about contract administration that we don't mention here, and I don't recall seeing it in the PMBOK, but there's also an activity that's called a procurement audit. And so we want to, once the procurement is all done, a lot of times this is done post-project, but if you want a very long project where vendors come and go, you want to maybe do these. And the idea is to go back and audit the process, not to look for issues, not to look for, what I'm trying to say. You're not trying to, it's not a gotcha thing. Okay. It's not like an IRS audit. It's like an improvement audit. So you want to go back and audit the process and find out what went well, what didn't go well, what should we change so we can improve this process as we go forward. It's a separate auditing function that we do in the project. So managing supplier performance during project execution protects the project outcome. So supplier performance must be actively monitored during project execution to protect schedule, cost, and stakeholder confidence. So once the contract is in place, the project's attention shifts from selection to performance. And at this stage, the key question is no longer whether the project suppliers look strong on paper, but it's whether suppliers actually delivering as required during execution. This is why supplier performance engagement is an important part of the project work. It also connects to the broader project performance. A supplier delay can affect the schedule. Poor supplier quality can create rework. Weak responsiveness can slow coordination and decision-making. Contract non-compliance can generate disputes, claims, or additional cost exposure. In that sense, supplier performance is not isolated from the project system. It's one of the drivers of project execution. And from the project manager's perspective, this means that external work has to be integrated with the internal priorities of the project and its dependencies. The deliverables have to arrive when they're needed. Obligations have to be clear. Issues have to be escalated early enough to matter. And supplier performance has to be interpreted not only from a contract viewpoint, but from a project outcome viewpoint. So the point is we have to integrate this in, and needs to be actively monitored. And we'll probably talk about it some more in the monitoring controlling area. Procurement performance depends on structured sourcing, sound contracts, and active execution oversight. Effective procurement performance depends on how well sourcing contracts and supplier engagement are managed throughout execution. And so before we turn to the cost management part of this, it's helpful to kind of take a step back and summarize what procurement means in the broader context of project performance. The lesson is that procurement is not a single purchasing activity or event. It's a connected management process that begins with defining internal and external needs, and continues through sourcing, contract formation, contract administration, and supplier performance oversight. So this is why the procurement decision has moved through all these stages. First, the project team must define what's needed. That's our make or buy. That's our sourcing strategy. And then engage the market in a structured way. And that's where this outsourcing or procurement department can help us with that. With the solicitation and bidder conferences, help reduce the ambiguity and improve the quality of supplier responses. And then proposal evaluation and source selection, turn those into award decision that should align with our project requirements, our risk conditions, and our performance expectations. And so after we award the contract, the work's not finished. The contract type affects how risk, flexibility, and control are distributed between buyer and seller. The contract administration execution align with the agreement, and the supplier performance monitoring helps ensure the deliverables, obligations, quality, and responsiveness continue to support the contract. In other words, procurement performance depends not only who's selected, but on how the relationship is structured and managed afterwards. So this is a bridge into the cost performance of this, because procurement choices and supplier performance directly influence cost exposure, forecasting, and overall project control. And so the next thing we want to do is take a break about that. And let's take about 15 minutes, come back at say 10 o'clock or a little before. When everybody gets back, we'll start back up. So we're going to take a short break before we move to cost management. And up to this point, we've been focusing on procurement. And so we'll see you in about 10, 15 minutes. All right. Thanks, everyone. Okay, let's get started back. We're going to move into the cost part of this as it relates to performance management. Cost management and earned value is our next focus. So we're going to shift our attention to cost control, forecasting, and earned value interpretation. So moving into sort of the financial side of project performance management. So all of these things we're looking at in this course is from the perspective of performing the project, managing that performance, which is essentially managing the project piece of it. Matter of fact, this course used to be called Project in the previous versions of the PMBOK. This is an important transition because procurement decision, contract structure, supplier performance, and contract administration all affect the project's cost behavior during execution. This is why in most project management courses, or even in training that you take or you get involved with, they'll cover procurement and costs at the same time. It's a pretty common approach, mainly because they're so related in terms of the cost part of it. So here we focus on how project managers manage cost performance while the work is underway. And that includes monitoring cost against the baseline, interpreting variances, forecasting likely outcomes, and using performance information to support project decision. We also are going to reintroduce some of the earned value concepts, which help us integrate schedule, cost, and work performance into a more complete view of project status. Cost management provides the foundation for performance and control. Cost management creates the baseline and control structure needed to interpret project performance. So cost management is not just about tracking expenses. It provides a structure for understanding and controlling project performance. It begins with planning how costs will be managed, including estimating, budgeting, and defining control mechanisms. In planning, we should have set all of the framework up for how we're going to accrue costs, time, all the rules of how we're going to manage and control, monitor costs. Now what we're doing here is we're executing those or carrying those out. The key output of the planning of all that is we're looking at our cost baseline, which it's the reference point for measuring project performance. And the cost, we have something in project management called the performance measurement baseline, and it's a combination of the schedule and cost. So it's a time-phased baseline. Some people just call it the cost baseline, and that's what we're looking at. And it's when we've created a schedule, we've estimated all the resources, we've estimated the cost of those resources. We've aggregated everything up. We have our contingency management, our management reserves, all of that into one budget. Then we apply all that onto the schedule of when things are supposed to be happening, when things are going to be getting paid, when we're going to be getting paid. All of those variables are all put on this baseline. And without a baseline, it's difficult to determine whether the project is performing well or whether it's drifting off a course. I wouldn't even bother I wouldn't use the word difficult again. I put it in here because, you know, it makes sense. But in reality, if you don't have a baseline or at least some kind of understanding of what you're supposed to be spending and when you're supposed to be spending it, you're going to be all over the place. You're going to be you don't have any control on it. So as execution progresses, actual costs are compared to these planned activities, and the comparison enables early detection of variances, and it supports forecasting future performance. And ultimately, cost management allows project managers to move beyond tracking spending to making informed decisions about project outcomes. Managing project costs during execution requires monitoring, control, and forecasting. So cost management during execution requires active monitoring, variance control, and forward-looking forecasting. What happens after the budget's been planned, or what happens after the budget's been planned or approved? Well, at this point, project management becomes an execution discipline. The project manager is no longer just estimating or budgeting work in advance, but we're actually monitoring what we're spending and interpreting performance signals and deciding whether corrective actions needed. There's some class notes on Moodle about project cost management, and we actually I've got this kind of set up in there where cost management includes cost estimation, cost budgeting, cost monitoring, cost control, cost forecasting. But during execution, the key activities are the monitoring actual costs against approved baseline and identifying variances. So this is all important because actual spending alone doesn't really tell the whole story. A project can appear financially acceptable for a time and still be trending towards overrun if changes or inefficiencies or supplier issues or productivity problems are not recognized early. And so this is why cost management during execution should include forecasting. The project manager needs to look ahead, not only ask what have we spent, but ask at where is the trend taking us? So a trend analysis. Cost control depends on managing causes of variance, not just recording them. If cost growth is tied to rework or delay, change, contract issues, or weak productivity, then control requires decisions and actions that address those underlying conditions. In that sense, cost management is tied directly to the broader project performance rather than existing as a separate accounting exercise. And all too often, we're all focused on getting work done. You know, it's much more fun to do things than it is to pay attention to sort of the accounting part of this. But as a good project manager is always really paying attention to where the money's being spent. Are we trending, you know, in a negative way, or are we trending in a positive way when it comes to spending? So cost management during execution means that monitoring, interpreting, controlling, and forecasting, making all these decisions can be made while there's still time to influence the outcomes. So that's what we're wanting to do, is we want to anticipate what's going on. The key indicator is cost. It's called cost variance. It's a pretty simple construct, but cost variance provides an early signal of emerging performance problems. Cost variance help project managers detect when actual spending is diverging from planned performance. So on the slide here, where's my mouse? There it is. They've got this, they're saying it's the early signal. This is where we're starting to depart from the plan. These little curves here, you'll see these graphs a lot in project management, and typically the baseline is depicted as an S curve. It has this basic S shape. It's not really that great, but it has that kind of, you know, low at the bottom, kind of steep in the middle, and flattens off at the top. And what they're showing is that we're starting to have some variance. And if we continue with the variance at this rate, we're going to be at, you know, somewhere out in time, we're going to be this far off. You know, it's really kind of like when you aim at something, like your camera at something, and just a few degrees off in the whole scene is a whole different scene, right? This kind of what we're looking at here. But the time to take action is at this early signal usually than it is to wait till we get out here. So once the project manager is monitoring actual cost against the approved baseline, the next idea is variance. So variance is not just a number on a report. It's a signal that project performance may be moving away from expectation. So in practical terms, cost variance reflects the differences between what the project has accomplished and what it's actually cost to accomplish it. And that's why variance is more meaningful than simply looking at spending in isolation. So looking at spending in isolation is not going to tell you what the variance is. You have to make that comparison to the baseline. The project may spend a large amount of money and still be performing acceptably if it's producing the expected amount of work. On the other hand, even modest spending can be problematic if the amount of completed work is lower than expected. If you're behind schedule and over budget, you're in double trouble, is what's saying from the project. And the class notes defines cost variance as a difference between earned value and actual cost. So we subtract, it's a subtraction problem. And with positive variance indicating the project is under budget and negative variance indicating the project is over budget. And this makes variance an important early warning signal. A negative variance may point to inefficiency, supplier problems, rework, underestimation, productivity issues, or any kind of uncontrolled changes. So as project managers, we should interpret variance rather than just report it. The question is not only whether variance exists, but what's causing it, whether it's likely to continue. When variance is recognized early, the team has a better chance to investigate the causes. So it's like I said, the time to take action is when you first see the signal starting to emerge. And we can prevent small performance drift from becoming a larger problem if we monitor this accordingly. Cost variance provides an early signal of emerging performance problems. So again, it's an emergent characteristic. Why actual cost alone doesn't show true project performance? You'll get this, well, we've spent this much and we're on budget. It doesn't really, whether you're on budget or not, without anything to analyze it with, you don't have really any kind of information. You have a data point, but you don't have information. The actual cost shows how much has been spent, but not whether the project has accomplished the planned amount of work. So before we introduce earned value, it's important to pause here a little bit and address the common misunderstanding in cost management, that actual cost alone does not reflect the true project's performance. Actual cost tells us how much money's been spent, but it doesn't tell us whether the project is producing the amount of work that was planned for that spending. This distinction matters because spending information by itself can be misleading. A project may appear to be doing well simply because it's spent less than expected, but that can happen when the work is late or incomplete. On the other hand, a project may be expensive at a given point in time, yet still performing reasonably when it's completed a substantial amount of the planned work. In other words, spending must be interpreted in relation to performance, not viewed in isolation. So in the class notes on earned value, I support this by defining actual cost as only one of three earned value data points. Alongside this planned value and earned value. So we have actual cost, planned value, and earned value. Those are the three steps we need. And in the notes, I explain that earned value management integrates scope, schedule, and cost information. So earned value management gives you an integrated view of all of those constraints. In the prior course, MGT6152, we talked about all this by emphasizing that earned value management provides integrated insight into the schedule, cost, and performance outcomes, rather than just relying on cost figures alone. Earned value management helps us answer the question of whether the project is ahead or behind schedule, under and over budget, and the remaining work is likely to cost. Actual cost, it's necessary to know what actual cost is, but it's not sufficient. As project managers, we need to compare spending with planned work and completed work to understand whether the performance is truly favorable or unfavorable. And that's the reason earned value becomes so important in the next part of the project. One of the key things about earned value also, and we made this point in the prior course, is that it needs to be planned for. A lot of projects don't really plan for it. And then they go and they want to apply it to their project. And what happens is you get different, it's not consistent. You don't have a structured approach to it. and you don't know whether what you're measuring is right, and a lot of problems. So the planning part of this is just as important. It's probably more important than the actual carrying it out. Because if you don't have it planned well, or at least set up well, you should do that. And a lot of project managers that I've worked with, they don't really think about it. One of the reasons too is that earned value is a really kind of a project management only concept. You're not likely to encounter it out in the world, doing operations work. It's more of because we're looking at performance on a scale of a baseline. You don't really have baselines you have fixed costs and variable costs and things like that in operations, but you don't really have a baseline. And so it's particularly project management only. And so a lot of people who don't come up through any kind of formal training have never been exposed to it, and they may be working as project managers. And I think they're missing out on something that could really help them. They also have a version of this. A lot of people say, well, we don't need earned value in the agile world, in the adaptive world. Well, there is such a thing as agile earned value. It's a little different, but it's still kind of a concept there. And one of the reasons that it is I think it's still true, but the federal government put into their contractual language a few years ago, maybe many years ago now, that all the reporting on costs had to be done using earned value in order to get paid. They paid you for the earned value so you had to have that built in, and that reinforced the whole process. Earned value, as I mentioned, integrates scope, schedule, cost into one performance review. Earned value provides a more complete view of project performance by integrating work accomplished with schedule and cost data. So now that the limitation of actual cost alone is clear, we can move into earned value management. Earned value is important because it gives the project manager a more complete performance picture than cost tracking by itself. Rather than looking only at how much money we've been spent, earned value asks how much work has been planned, how much work has actually been accomplished, and what it costs to accomplish that work. This integrated view is what makes earned value useful. Traditional cost tracking can tell us whether spending is high or low, but it doesn't fully explain whether the project is truly performing well. Earned value solves that problem by combining the three elements of scope, schedule, and cost into one measurement approach. So we're measuring all three using this approach. And when these elements are viewed together, project managers can interpret performance more accurately and identify whether the project is ahead, behind, or over budget or under budget, and even behind schedule and ahead of schedule. Earned value notes that I have are a little more systematic about this and go into much more detail. And so we also established the three variables I talked about. The three elements, the plan value, earned value, and actual cost provide the core data for earned value analysis. Once we understand why earned value provides more complete performance view, the next step is to define the three core data points that make earned value analysis possible. These are plan value, or PV. It used to be budgeted cost of work scheduled. So so you may see those, but it's plan value. Earned value is the actual cost of work performed, and actual cost has always been actual cost. And together they form a foundation for the variance and index calculations that follow. Plan value represents the budgeted amount of work that was supposed to be completed by a certain point in time. It's tied to the approved baseline and reflects where the project was expected to be. Earned value represents the budgeted value of the work that has actually been completed. This is important because it expresses completed work in budget terms. So we take completed work and put it in dollars, making it possible to compare planned progress and actual accomplishment. Then actual cost represents what's actually been spent to perform the completed work so far. The key idea is that these three measures should be understood conceptually before the formulas make sense. And if we know what each one represents, then the later calculations become interpretations of project reality rather than just arithmetic. The plan value tells us where the project should be. Earned value tells us what's been accomplished, and plan value in terms of actual cost tells us what's been spent. So the key message of this slide is that PV, EV, and AC are the core data set for earned value analysis. And once those measures are clear, we can move into cost variance, schedule variance, I think something called CPI, which is cost performance index, and SPI, which is schedule performance index. We can take these 3 data points and calculate all that information. And I'm not going to go deep dive in this course into all those calculations. One is they're not required for any of the assignments or anything, but you will need to know them if you're going to do the PMP eventually someday. But they're simple arithmetic. The cost value and schedule variances reveal whether performance is tracking to plan. Cost and schedule variances show whether project performance is above or below planned expectations. So you can see these are just cost variance, earned value minus actual cost, and schedule variance is earned value minus planned value. And so we can tell whether or not we're ahead of schedule, behind schedule, below budget, or over budget, just with these 2 things. So once planned value and earned value and costs are defined, the next step is to compare them in ways that reveal whether the project is performing as expected. The first 2 earned value metrics used for the purpose of cost variance and schedule variance. These measures help us as project managers see whether the cost performance and schedule performance are favorable or unfavorable at a given point in time. So we're looking at these things in just one particular point in time. Cost variance compares earned value, in other words, what have we accomplished, to the actual cost in simple terms. It asks whether the value of the work accomplished is greater or less than what it costs to perform that work. If earned value is higher than actual cost, the project is under budget for the work completed. If earned value is lower than actual cost, the project is over budget. That's why cost variance equals earned value minus actual cost is a useful early measure of cost performance. Schedule performance, and we'll talk about that here. It's not exactly budget, but we're still, when we do the schedule analysis in earned value, everything gets interpreted in terms of cost, dollars. So we might say we're $175,000 behind schedule. Then we have to convert that into time to figure out the duration. Usually we can do that using the schedule. A lot of times, places I've been will have a what they call an overhead combined number, and so it takes into account not only salaries but takes into account overhead, and so we call it a loaded number. And they'll use that and they'll say, okay, every hour is 200 hours loaded time, and so we'll take that 175,000 divided by 200, and that tells us how many hours of work we're behind schedule. That's how we convert all of that into dollars. And so earned value is combining everything into dollars. Schedule variance compares earned value. It asks whether the project has accomplished more or less work than planned. And so that's the same thing. We're looking at whether we're behind schedule or ahead of schedule. If the earned value is greater than planned value, then the project is ahead of schedule. If earned value is less than the planned value, then the project is behind schedule. And so the formula for that is schedule variance equals earned value minus planned value. And again, it's just so far, it's just arithmetic. At this point, there's no algebra and no calculus in here. There is a field of study, econometrics, that covers some of this kind of thing, but it's way beyond this. It's essentially a statistics course, and we don't cover that in this class. It's out of scope, but it does apply. Yeah, CPI and SPI show how effectively cost and schedule performance are aligned. CPI and SPI indicate how efficiently project funds and planned work are being converted. So these are our indices, as you will. These are indexes. Anytime you divide, so this is division, you can call it index. So after looking at the variances, the next step is to introduce performance indices, or how well are we performing. While variances show whether the performance is favorable or unfavorable, the indices show how efficiently the project is performing relative to cost and schedule expectations. Again, relative to our baseline. That makes them especially useful for interpreting trends and supporting forecasting. Cost performance index, or CPI, is calculated as earned value divided by actual cost. And it shows how efficiently project funds are being used. A CPI of greater than 1 indicates the project is getting more value from each dollar spent than expected. A CPI of less than 1 indicates weaker cost efficiency. In practical terms, CPI helps answer whether what we're spending is producing value at an acceptable rate. So you may have a CPI that's favorable. In other words, we're getting like $1.20 worth of expected planned value for every hour we spend or every dollar we spend. It doesn't mean things are rosy. You need to look into it. In other words, we plan to be at a certain point, but we're either above it or below it. Why is that favorable? Did we miss something? Is somebody not doing some work that should be doing and it's just showing up as being under budget, but there's still work out there that needs to be done? You need to be able to answer those questions, but this can give you an idea of the order of magnitude. On the other side, Schedule Performance Index, or SPI, is calculated by dividing the earned value by planned value. This shows how efficiently the project is progressing against the plan, the schedule. And SPI greater than 1 indicates the project is progressing faster than planned, while a SPI less than 1 indicates slower than planned. In other words, SPI reflects whether the project is converting planned work into completed work efficiency. So CPI and SPI go beyond just simple favorable versus unfavorable comparisons. They help us as project managers understand how efficient the project is using money and time, and they provide a stronger basis for forecasting and taking corrective action. So you can take these efficiency numbers and apply them to and say, okay, well, if we continue at this rate, and you can predict that variance in that number that we saw in the previous example. And you can start looking at that. You can look at you can revise your estimate at completion. This is where forecasting comes in. Earned value forecasting helps predict the final cost performance before the project ends. Earned value forecasting uses current performance trends to estimate the likely total project cost and remaining cost to complete. So once variances and indices are understood, the next step here is moving into forecasting. This is where earned value becomes especially useful decision-making, for management decision-making. Instead of only describing current performance, earned value forecasting helps project managers estimate where the project is likely to be if current trends continue. So in the earned value in the class notes, I've defined all of these: estimate to completion, estimate at completion, estimate to completion, variance at completion, to complete performance index. So read those notes well. It's all stuff we covered in the planning, but essentially the estimate at completion is what we think the project's going to cost when we're done from today going forward. It could be the beginning of the project. It could be the middle of the project. Estimate to complete is how much money it's going to take us to complete the project. It could be more or less. The variance at completion is what we think the variance is going to be at the end. And the to complete index is an interesting one because what it tells us is that, okay, we're behind schedule, say 10% behind schedule. But say we want to make that up and be on schedule at the end. That probably means since we're already operating at 10% less efficiency than what we planned to operate, in order to get to the estimate completion that we originally planned, we're going to have to operate at maybe 110 or 15% of what we planned to make up that lost time. In other words, we're going to be actually more efficient than what we are, and we're already behind schedule, so we're already inefficient. How are we going to not only get to efficiency, but how are we going to improve on that in order to catch up? And that's that to complete index. And it'll tell you what that number is, what that efficiency number is. And it's important because if you're behind schedule and you go to your sponsor and you say, look, we're 10% behind schedule, and they're going to say, well, okay, we need to hire more people or whatever, make it up to 100%. You're going to say, well, no, but if we get to 100% and we operate as planned here on out, we're still going to be behind schedule. We're still not going to make our date. We're going to need more than what you're expecting. So it's a good way to communicate to stakeholders what's reality, and it gives you a way to defend those ask more resources, more staffing, or even to cut scope if you need to. It gives you defensible corrective action, put it that way. So this is intended to be a worked example. There's a lot of numbers on here, but this example is from the notes, these numbers are, but the calculations could be is that cost variance here is $48,000 minus $70,000, which is a negative $22,000, which indicates the project is over budget. The schedule variance is the earned value minus planned value, which is 48,000 minus 60,000, which indicates the project is behind schedule. So already right there, a couple of red flags. So now we can calculate the CPI and SPI. And if we carry out the calculations, we show that we have a 0.69, the CPI. So in other words, for every dollar we're spending, we're only getting 69 cents worth of planned value out of it. In other words, we're almost 30% behind schedule. Yeah.
If the project is not done yet, how do we estimate the planned value?
The planned value comes from the baseline. The question was, if the project's not done yet, how do you find the planned value? Well, you go to your baseline and say, okay, today is Saturday, April 11th. Go to the schedule baseline, the time phase budget performance baseline I talked about, and say, what do we plan to do? So we plan to have, say, $150,000 worth of our work done in there. That's where it comes from. So always go back. Everything's compared to the baseline. And then we have a 80% schedule performance index. So we're 20% behind schedule. So the main gist here behind this is not to just blind you with numbers, but the idea is that we can take these simple formulas, they're essentially arithmetic formulas, turns them to meaningful information for us as project managers. The project's not simply spending too much money, but in this case, it's spending too much money relative to the amount of work it's accomplished. And it's also producing less progress than planned at this point in time. So this combination tells the project manager that both schedule and cost need attention. And earned value metrics they're not just simply calculation. They're decision signals. It's surveillance, if you will. You observe something and surveil it. Same thing here. We're observing these numbers and we're paying attention to them. They help project managers interpret what's happening in practice and decide whether corrective action or planning or replanning is needed, whether we need to escalate something, or whether we need to make some kind of adjustments based on that. So I've got another little quick example here. So what do you think about this project? What do you think about the health of this project is? This is a typical, whoops, let me go back. Try to get my mouse over there. Okay. So these are typical curves here. In this project, they're week 6 is where they show the end, but we're right here in week 3 when they're taking the measurement. This is our report date. And we got actual cost of $500,000. We have planned value, which is right here at $300,000, and we've earned $175,000.
So it's not good.
Not good, right? This project's in trouble. So if we go to the next slide, it shows that we have a schedule variance of $125,000. And if we go to the next one, and think about cost variance, if you notice that, let me do it so they can see. And the cost variance, it starts from the earned value and it goes all the way up to the actual cost. So a lot of times people say, well, we're at $175,000 and we only need to, we should be at 300. So we're only, like 125,000 different, but no, this is what we've actually spent, right? So they got a cost variance there of $375,000. If I was doing this, called in, and I've been on projects that get this far out of control, the problem when you get variances this large is that the actions that it takes to correct them essentially warrant a whole new project. If I was hauled in hired as a consultant and I was going back to whoever hired me to look into it, I would probably tell them that this project should be terminated. And if they want to continue with what they want to deliver, they should go back and replan the entire project. And all the money that they spent so far is just sunk cost. It's just gone. There's a fallacy that happens a lot in projects, in anything we do. I mean, it happens to us all. Well, we've already spent $500,000 on this, so let's just spend a little more and things will get better. They don't. In accounting, you'll study this. It's called the fallacy of sunk cost. Management people get caught up in this, and even like a home repairs, it's like, well, I just make another trip to Lowe's, we can fix this. Well, sometimes maybe got to bring a contractor in and dig up the whole yard to fix it. We had a problem with that kind of situation where the sewer line in front of the house, we live in this old house and it's had an iron sewer line. It was getting rusted out, and we kept just fixing it, patching it. Finally, we just had to we wasted a lot of money doing that. We finally had to have it completely dug up and redone. That's what needs to happen here. But this is a pretty typical way. These little S charts, and you'll see I put on here, I've got the older terminology, a budgeted cost of work schedule. You may see that in practice, and especially if you're going to be doing, I've had students go on and get their PhD or work on their PhD. Most of them, I think all of them have eventually got it. But what they do when you're doing a doctoral work, you spend a lot of time looking at papers, research stuff. And then you'll run into this, if you do that, you'll run into the older terminology because it's still used some. One way to calculate, this is just an example of how to calculate cost performance index. So we have a project that has an earned value of $25,000 and an actual cost of 27. And so their earned value is 25,000. Actual costs, they've spent 27, but the project is only 25% complete. So they're at a 0.93 CPI. This may be helpful, may not. But it's favorable. I mean, it's unfavorable that we're over budget, excuse me. We may need to only $2,000 here at this point. You'd have to go back and analyze that and figure out if that makes sense. So the cost performance index is 0.35 on the project we just looked at. So they're only operating at 35% efficiency from terms of cost.
So how do they know the earned value in project, how do they get that number for the earned value? They know the planned value, right? It's already.
They know the planned value. The earned.
How do they get the earned value?
Okay. The question is, how do they get the earned value? Well, as you complete work, you're going to show it completed in your baseline. And then you're going to basically just add up the budget numbers for that. That's why the time performance baseline, you apply it to the schedule. And so you apply your cost all the way across there. And for this work package, it's accepted, and its value, planned value was, $100. Say we cost us $120 to do. That's the earned value. It costs us $120 to produce $100 of planned value. That's how that works. Okay, yeah, it all goes back to that time budget. Now, this is a schedule performance index for that project. They're only operating at a 0.58, 58%. So essentially for every hour they spend, they're only getting 58% of what they planned on in this project. Now we can use, this is a different project, but we can use, because if I was to try to forecast on this project here, if I was going to try to forecast this actual cost number out, it would be way up at top of the screen. So I got this new project here, and this one shows kind of a typical way to look at this. And we're trying to figure out what's going on with our project. In this case, they've got a CPI of 0.8, and they're wanting to know the original estimate completion was what, 10,000 and 10,050, and they divide that by their CPI. Now their new estimate completion becomes 1,300, and let's just say that's $1,312,000. So $1.3 million now. It extends that. So you can see at the top how that's done. And also the dotted line going out past the timeline there shows that it's going to be, I don't show it on here, the scheduled performance index, but it shows that they're going out, you're going to extend the project by another period. It looks like a whole nother, whatever the accounting period here is. Let's just say that's a month. It's going to be a month late and $300,000 over budget when it gets done. And you can forecast that. And what you can say is that the PBM, that's that performance measurement baseline, that's today, it's a snapshot. So our earned value, planned value, all of that stuff is just a snapshot of where we are today. At 80% schedule efficiency, if we continue to operate that way with no, we expect the uncertainty to be normal, or we know atypical events that we expect to be over budget that much. Now the question here is that acceptable or not? Well, that would be between the project manager and the sponsors or stakeholders. It may be that there's been enough change in here that we can build that in. Now, if you've got proper change management, you would update this baseline to reflect that change management, right? So it doesn't mean the baselines have to be permanent, but it has to be a deliberate decision to add change scope. Say you found out something that you didn't anticipate, got to be done. And it happened, like at my house is 100 years old. And anytime we've ever done any work, it's always stuff we hadn't planned to do. So it's become, for us, it's become so common that when I have a contractor out to estimate something, I always double what they say. So you get used to that. You can do that and head some of this off in planning. But at this project, you go in there and you say, well, okay, we got all these change requests. Is that intended scope? And then, yes, we can build that in. And then we might want to rebaseline the project. But really not very often that you would want to rebaseline it. Most projects will continue with that, and they'll have like a report that shows the addition, what this cost, additional cost is. Now they're behind schedule by say $1 million here. You can see this EV 400. So they're behind schedule. Well, their variance is, the cost variance is 100. Their schedule variance is probably, looking at that screen, probably 60 or something like that. I'd have to get out a calculator and do that, but it's hard to do standing up here in front of you guys. But well, I'm trying to figure out the schedule performance index in my head, but I think it would probably be about 60 or 70, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So this is the kind of things you can do from a performance management perspective with earned value. You can look at your project and you can make these decisions, and it makes your job a lot easier as a project manager when you go to an executive sponsor and say, hey, this are the conditions and this is what we need to do. And you don't go and complain. You go there and say, this is the results. And these are some root causes. These are some things I think we can do, and work that out. I did when I was working with Bell Labs up in Piscataway, what they did is when they funded projects, they were funded like little businesses. And so as a project manager, you were kind of like the CEO of the internal business. But they had people, they had this big giant budget, and they would apportion your budget, and they wanted to know what's going on. And so if I needed more money, it'd be like going to the board of directors and saying, I need more money. And so I would have to go in, and this is what they wanted. They wanted earned value, they wanted alternative, and then they would decide which alternative they were willing to fund. And also what I had to do is, as the project, you see this thing up here that we hadn't talked about, this little management reserve up here. Well, if the project is 50% done, like say this project is, then this part of the management reserve, in my instance, they wanted that money back. It wasn't really actually given to us, but it was like apportioned on their books. And so it wasn't available to anybody else. And if 50% goes by and we hadn't used it, they wanted the money back. And if I wanted to keep the money in the budget, I needed to justify that. And I could probably, with this screen here, I could probably say, well, we're going to be, at our current performance, we're going to be $300,000 over budget. So I'd like to keep that management reserve. And that's what management reserve is for. Management reserve is for unexpected. When we talk about risk analysis, we'll talk about management reserve, but it's for unplanned, what they call unknown unknowns. A contingency reserve, which we don't show on here, is for the risk part of it, for known unknowns. And we'll talk about those reserves later on. We covered them pretty good in the planning class, but we'll talk about how we use those when we get into a risk performance. So let me move on here. So the takeaways today are that procurement, cost control, and earned value strengthen project performance. So we come back to the central idea that project performance depends on connected management disciplines rather than isolated activities. So in other words, all these things are connected. The procurement section showed that project managers still need practical sourcing knowledge, contract awareness, supplier oversight, even when procurement is organizational led, when it's an organizational function. It doesn't get us off the hook. We can't just say, well, it's their problem. It's not, it's your problem. And the cost section showed that project cost management is not just budgeting or spending control. It involves monitoring actual performance, identifying variances, and forecasting outcomes, and taking action while there's still time to influence the results. One of the most important things that from today is that cost information by itself is incomplete. And knowing when something, knowing that something's been spent doesn't tell us whether the project has accomplished the amount of work that it's planned. So given the questions, give me 2 questions. How do we know? Well, we have to go to the baseline to see if, whether that number makes sense. It integrates, the baseline integrates scope, schedule, and cost, or earned value integrates scope, schedule, cost into one management view. And the performance measurement baseline, the PMB, is essentially the cost baseline. That's where that comes from. All this aligns well with performance measurement, earned value forecasting, and using metrics to improve project outcomes. All these numbers do. So the procurement, cost control, and earned value are not separate topics to memorize independently. They're connected execution disciplines that help project managers recognize problems earlier and interpret performance more accurately and make better decisions to protect schedule, cost, quality, and stakeholder outcome. Also, to defend resource requests, ask, all those sort of things to that. They're also, especially earned value, reports like earned value. When we get in an adaptive world, it's a little different, but the same kind of thing is, this is transparency. You're just showing objectively what the numbers are. You're not trying to put anything on, any kind of bias. You're not trying to interpret anything. This is just where we are. This is the speedometer. And this tells us how fast we're going, how slow we're going, how much gas we're using. Are we driving safely? That's the decision that you have to kind of make. Do that. And this is going back to one of the questions I get a lot lately, and not so much from classrooms, but some, but it's, what about AI? Is it going to take our jobs away? No, I don't think so. Not anytime soon, because I don't think AI can determine whether or not a project is performing. They can tell you the project is behind schedule and all that, but whether that means it's doing well or it's healthy or not, I don't think the AI can do that yet. And from what I've seen the last few weeks, I don't know if it'll ever be capable of doing that. Not, at least not in my lifetime. Maybe y'all's. Y'all are much younger than me. But one of the things, I don't think we have enough electricity in our solar system to produce that kind of intelligence. Okay, the end. Thank you all very much. And this was a long one. I appreciate your dedication to this. And I'll get this posted out on the web, and I'll see you all next week, or online next week, online.